Once upon a time, there was this little game called Street Fighter II. Some of you might have heard of it or even played it. Now, we all know Street Fighter II's legacy and how it went down in the history books. Unfortunately, for another fighting franchise that started that same year, Fatal Fury was easily overshadowed by the former runaway hit. To me, the Fatal Fury series was kinda like Street Fighter on steroids. Not necessarily in an overall sense, but in the visual sense, you better believe it. While the CP system board that Street Fighter II was based around had very similar hardware components to SNK's Neo Geo hardware, the Neo Geo was still capable of displaying over 100 more sprites on the screen at once. This gave the Fatal Fury series, even the original game, a much more vibrant and in-depth presentation. Lastly, before we begin, one more tidbit of information. The creator of Fatal Fury, Takahashi Nishiyama, was also the director of the original Street Fighter 89. Yes, the man who created the original Street Fighter would now be going head-to-head with his own creation in the arcades. Anyways, on to the first game. Fatal Fury, released in 1991, was the first to be released on the Neo Geo arcade circuit. Unlike other fighting games of the time, Fatal Fury does feature a storyline, albeit just serving the gameplay itself, and not really that complicated. In a city called Southtown, you play as one of three fighters. Brothers Terry and Andy Bogard, and their friend Joe Higashi. The story is the usual revenge motif, as the last boss of the game, Geese Howard, is responsible for murdering Terry and Andy's father 10 years ago. Thus, the trio enter a tournament called King of Fighters, in hopes of kicking the shit out of Geese to avenge their father. I'm not sure what Joe's motivation is for going along. Maybe he just needs to get out his aggression. Or hell, maybe he just enjoys kneeing people in the face while surrounded by fire. Oh, and yeah, SNK would later go on to develop an actual series of fighting games known as the King of Fighters, which is still being made in different variations to this day. You fight your way through several different fighters, each having different combat tactics and abilities. You'll notice that even though there are special moves in this game, they're much more physically based attacks than, say, Street Fighter II, in its myriad of projectiles, supernatural moves, and whatnot. Each of the fighters you face aren't terribly difficult, but sometimes they can catch you off guard. It's interesting to point out that the character of Raiden, no affiliation with the Mortal Kombat franchise at this point, was obviously the later inspiration for the character of Earthquake from the Samurai Shodown series. Their stage music is also very similar. Have you ever paid close attention to the background sprites? Take this level here. If you look, this fat guy in the green shirt appears not once, not twice, but 3 times in the background of this level. Must have a bunch of clones, or SNK was a tad lazy with the smaller details. One of the main attributes of the entire Fatal Fury series is its multiple fighting lanes. With almost any fighting game back in the early 90s, you were limited to just a single lane to fight on. With Fatal Fury, you now had the foreground and the background lane to fight in. Things always got a little tense when you were almost dead and the computer started jumping back and forth between lanes because you were never quite sure if you would hit each other when switching. You make it all the way to Geese, kick his ass off his own building, and the game ends. Overall, the presentation of the first Fatal Fury title was very well done. It doesn't feature many memorable pieces of music or sound effects that the later games will, but this is the original, so it's allowed not to be perfect. Plus, it's the first time we get to hear the cool announcer's echoey voice saying, "Round 2, and he would return in almost every game in the series. Very iconic and memorable to me. A year after the original release on the Neo Geo arcade unit, we get the sequel, Fatal Fury 2. Keep in mind that in the release chronology of SNK, Samurai Shodown wouldn't have its first game out for another year. So the Fatal Fury series was still getting a lot of good attention at the time. Fatal Fury 2 was only the second game released at the time that featured SNK's 100 Megashock opening title, indicating the game was over 100 megabits in size. This nearly doubled the amount of game data from the previous title, thus giving a huge thrust forward in especially the graphics department. The original trio from the first game return, however, the selectable character roster has been nearly tripled for this release, most notably the introduction of Mai Shiranui and Big Bear, who was Raiden in the first game. Another large change for this release is that you're no longer confined to a small section of town that was Southtown. You now have the entire world to run around in and kick some major ass. Character movements and even background sprite details have been greatly improved, with character actions now being more fluid than the first release. The twin lanes of fighting have returned, but now on certain stages, there are actually hazards that you can knock your opponent into to cause extra damage, case in point, the bulls running in the background of Lawrence's stage. Speaking of stages, one of the cool things that SNK added was time passage during rounds of fighting. Some levels start during the daytime, but as you go to round 2, or even round 3 sometimes, the time of day changes to night or to sunset, etc. It's sometimes subtle, but I think it's a good example of the early attention to detail that SNK would be known for later on. The sound and music have also been improved, with Andy Bogart's stage in Italy probably being my favorite piece of music in the game. Fatal Fury 2 is the first game in the series to add desperation moves, or what I just always called super moves. Much like Samurai Showdown and its super moves, these are special attacks that can only be triggered if your health bar is flashing and close to death. Much like I mentioned in the Samurai Showdown series review, these moves are not displayed on screen, and back in the day, unless you bought a certain issue of Electronic Gaming Monthly, guess what? You're shit out of luck. But I'll get to the super moves when I'm talking about Fatal Fury 3 more. At the end of the game, you face off against Wolfgang Krauser. And again, look at the background details. This easily could have been just a boss fight in an empty palace, but just adding those orchestral musicians and the steps in the background really fleshes out the stage and gives a great ending. Lastly noted, this game, according to the ending text, takes place only 6 days after you threw Geese Howard's ass off his own building, thus giving a reason for Wolfgang to come after you in the first place. Released a little less than a year later, Fatal Fury Special is my personal favorite among the original games. It's basically the same as Fatal Fury 2 with a few enhancements and minor changes. The gameplay speed has been turned up slightly. Also, the character roster has been increased by another 4 playable characters. Other than those few changes, I mainly played this game because of Tung Fu Rue's stage music. It's totally badass. And is one of my great memories growing up during the arcade years. It's also one of the few games I actually owned when I had my Neo Geo AES system. We come to the final game in the original series. There were other releases subsequent to this one, but this is the last Fatal Fury game I remember playing in arcade form, and afterwards, pretty much left the series alone, since around this time is when the PlayStation was nearing launch. The story in this game can be summed up in a single sentence. The King of Fighters tournament equals ancient scrolls believed to give power to the best fighter. Okay.
Fatal Fury 3! Road to the final victory.
The basic design elements are the same. They've just been tweaked here and there. Instead of having 2 planes to move around and fight in, Fatal Fury 3 adds a 3rd plane. You now begin in the middle plane and can move either forward or backward depending on what you want to do. There has also been a ranking system implemented for each round, again, depending on how well you do. The graphics have been updated as well, as they now resemble the more animated style of Samurai Showdown 3. You make your way to the end, fight some schmo that's totally forgettable, and that's it. I see the ending as lacking, but remember, this is a fighting game, so simplicity is the name of the game. Overall, the Fatal Fury series is one of my favorites from growing up, and occasionally, I'll still fire up MAME to have around in Fatal Fury Special. It really was a phenomenal series that gave Street Fighter II a run for its money back in the 90s, and I'm glad I was there to experience it. Thanks for watching, thanks for subscribing, go check it out.